Week 5 is here and the quarterback position has been all over the place. Some steady, some struggling, and a few surprises creeping into the top 10. Let's look at how the rankings shake out for week number 5. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings between Jake and Kyle. And for more detailed analysis, make sure to check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted this week. If you want even more breakdowns each week, be sure to join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below, because that's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot in our Discord. Those are clutch as we head into these bye weeks, especially that flex video. All right, now before we dive in, we've got a few hits and misses from last week. Our first hit was Bo Nix, and it's been kind of hit or miss to start the season, but we kept him pretty high at QB6, and last week he finished at QB5. What about Jordan Love? Of course, the matchup was great, and that's why we had him at QB7, and then he went out and did what he was supposed to do, and he finished at QB6. And then what about Baker Mayfield? Baker was banged up, his pass catchers were banged up, and he had a tough matchup against Philly, but we still left him inside of the top 12 at QB11, and he finished at QB10. All right, so that's our hits. What about our misses? What about Caleb Williams? Caleb, he's been on fire the first 3 weeks, and with that passing game, we had him way too high. The Vegas defense contained him for the most part, and so you got to give them a lot of credit. Our next miss was Justin Herbert, and between the injuries of the offensive line and the Giants front creating a ton of pressure, he underperformed, and we had him too high. The next miss was Daniel Jones, and you know that we didn't really buy into the early season hype, but we still thought that Jones had a decent floor. We dropped him to QB10, but the Rams defense was just too much for him, and he was barely a top 25 quarterback. Okay, that's it for the hits and misses. Let's look at tier number 1 at the quarterback position. We've got Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Jayden Daniels, and Justin Fields. At number 1, no surprise, we've got Josh Allen. He's basically locked into the number 1 spot at this point, and he's currently the QB1 overall on the season, averaging almost 25 fantasy points per game. And now he gets New England, who is in the middle of the pack defense against quarterbacks this season. At number 2, we've got Patrick Mahomes. And you know something? A lot of people don't realize that Mahomes is averaging 22.4 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's done it without having all of his pass catching weapons on the season. Worthy looked great in week 4, and the Jags allow over 17 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, so we like Mahomes at number 2. At number 3, we've got Justin Herbert, and not the best day for Herbert last week. He loses the game, and then Jackson Dart tries to take his girlfriend, and he also lost his best offensive lineman who got hurt. But the upside to this is that it could lead to a lot more short throws, and Washington allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. At number 4, we've got Jayden Daniels going into LA, and he makes his return from injury, and it doesn't sound like he's going to have Terry McLaurin, but he also gets the Chargers, who just allowed Jackson Dart over 19 fantasy points in his first ever start. And then at number 5, surprising maybe, but we've got Justin Fields. He didn't even look like he wanted to throw in the first half of Monday Night Football, but in true Justin Fields fashion, he ran for 81 yards and a touchdown, and now he gets Dallas, who may be the worst defense in the NFL. Now, before we head over to the next tier, I want to make sure that you're hooked up on Underdog Fantasy. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. You're also going to get a first-time deposit bonus and a free player pick'em. And you already know that Jake is breaking down the best picks weekly in a show on Fridays, and he's crushing it. So links to join are in the description below, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, that's enough of that. Let's look at tier number 2. We've got Dak Prescott, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, Jalen Hurts, Drake May, Bo Nix, and Kyler Murray. At number 6, we've got Dak Prescott. And at times we saw Miami moving the ball at will against the Jets defense in week 4. And you pair that with the fact that Dak and the Cowboys have the worst defense in the league, and I could see Dak finding plenty of success in this shootout matchup. At number 7, we've got Jared Goff going into Cincinnati. And listen, there's one of two things that we could see happening here. Number one, Detroit gets up by 3 scores and they just run the ball all game. Or Goff has one of those games with less than 20 attempts, but he has 3 touchdowns and he finishes as a top 10 quarterback on the week because Cincinnati allows almost 20 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. They bad. At number 8, we've got Baker Mayfield, and it's great to see Baker get Chris Godwin back, but it's going to take some time for him to get back up to game speed. Baker has continued to produce despite matchups or injuries, but Seattle has only allowed 15.6 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks on the year. At number 9, we've got Jalen Hurts, and it's crazy to think that Hurts has thrown for less than 155 yards in 3 of the 4 games this year. They just can't move the ball in the air. And Hurts has been saved by his rushing production. Denver also allows the fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks of all the teams in the NFL. At number 10, we've got Drake May going into Buffalo, and he's the current QB4 overall in the season and averaging 21.4 fantasy points per game. He now has 9 total touchdowns in 4 weeks, and he's been completing 74% of his passes. He's truly playing great, but now he gets a tough matchup against Buffalo on the road. At number 11, we've got Bo Nix, and thankfully his production through the air has made up for his lack of running in 2025. He has 8 total touchdowns in 4 weeks, and now he goes on the road to Philly, who just allowed Baker to throw for 289 yards and 2 touchdowns against them in week number 4. At number 12, we've got Kyler Murray, and Kyler is currently the QB 15 on the year, but man, doesn't every single week feel like a disaster. He was saved by a late drive in week 4, but with that said, Tennessee this week is going to be much easier to run on than throw on, so hopefully we'll get Kyler scrambling a little bit this week. All right, that's it for tier number 2. Let's look at tier number 3. We've got Matthew Stafford, Brock Purdy, Jackson Dart, Sam Darnold, Daniel Jones, CJ Stroud, Tua Tagovailoa, and Geno Smith. At number 13, we've got Matthew Stafford. And when Puka and Adams are healthy, Stafford is a safe weekly floor play quarterback. He's the QB 12 on the year. But keep in mind, typically San Fran has played him tough, and on the year that the 49ers are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. At number 14, we've got Jackson Dart, and we would have loved to have seen him with Malik Neighbors, but what we saw in week 4 was still very exciting, especially with the rushing ability. I mean, that's going to help his floor weekly, and now he gets New Orleans, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. At number 15, we've got Sam Darnold, and he's one of the most consistent quarterbacks over the last 3 weeks. He's scored at least 16 fantasy points in 3 straight. Now, on the other hand, he has yet to score 18 fantasy points in a game yet this year, but he should have that chance this week against Tampa. At number 16, we've got Daniel Jones, and can you feel that? The high is starting to wear off, and all the Daniel Jones truthers are getting very quiet. He's now seen his fantasy points drop in 4 straight, and over the past 2 weeks, he hasn't had more than 1 passing touchdown, and he has no rushing touchdowns, so we had to drop him a little bit in the rankings. At number 17, we've got CJ Stroud, and typically a matchup on the road against Baltimore isn't ideal, but right now, the Ravens are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Stroud hasn't been great, but he has been progressively better in each of the last 3 games. At number 18, we've got Tua Tagovailoa, and listen, losing Tyreek Hill is tough, but adding Darren Waller could be a huge help, and if he can adopt that Jonnu Smith role from last year, it's going to help Tua have a chance at some decent games, but it's a tough matchup. Carolina is really tough to throw the ball on. At number 19, we've got Geno Smith, and 7 interceptions in 4 weeks. It's not something that gives fantasy owners a lot of confidence, especially since Vegas is always trailing and throwing, yet Geno hasn't gone over 180 yards in 2 of his last 3 games. The upside is that Indy does allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And then rounding out the top 20, we've got Trevor Lawrence. And between bye weeks and injuries, he squeaks in at the end. And at some point, this passing offense in Jacksonville is going to get it going. This isn't a great matchup this week, but it is easier to throw on Kansas City than it is to run on them. And so that's our top 20 at tiers 1, 2, and 3. We got 2 guys on the outside looking in, and that is Carson Wentz and Bryce Young. And that wraps up the quarterback rankings for week number 5. And let us know in the comments which quarterback you're going to be rolling with. And don't forget to check out the running back, wide receiver, and tight end rankings videos on the channel to set your full lineup. Let's go get that W this week, Headliner Nation. Peace.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels, not